I'm just recording myself, if that's all right with you all.
I really want to put on the website.
Well, it's kind of a bummer that it's raining, but it's also, I think, pretty apt for what I'll be speaking to you all about today. I'm fine to keep this fairly casual. So if folks have questions during the presentation, I have my notes down. Feel free to interrupt me if you have questions if they pop up. That's absolutely fine. But I'm Harrison Nesbitt. I'm the Community Adaptation Manager at Groundwork Hudson Valley. And really pleased to be speaking with you all tonight about nature-based solutions to address extreme heat and flooding. So I'm going to do a little bit of background into what Groundwork Hudson does and our role along the Sawmill River. I'll get into a really great report that we just put together that takes 4 case studies for nature-based solutions along the Sawmill River. And I heard that someone here might be interested in flood modeling, so I have a few slides plugged in on that as well. Groundwork Hudson Valley is an environmental nonprofit. We're based in Yonkers, New York, and our organization has 3 program areas: sustainability education, which offers STEM curriculum to Yonkers public schools and operates the Science Barge up here, which is a floating living laboratory on the Hudson River that's open to the public summer through fall. It's really, really wonderful. We have our youth programs or youth leadership or green team, and that's 30 youth from Yonkers public schools who learn leadership skills through paid hands-on environmental work, planting trees, removing invasives, tabling at events. It's a really wonderful opportunity. And then there is the climate resilience program that is now the community adaptation program. Bit of us countering some doublespeak that's going on. And we do a number of things. I think like the best way to put it is we promote nature-based solutions for adapting to warmer and wetter weather. And we do that through geospatial analysis, reports, demonstration projects. And some of our programs include an air quality monitoring project, a tree inventory project, community planting events, and some other stuff that I'll get to. And maybe the longest standing is our role as being a coordinator of the Sawmill River Coalition. But first, just want to bring up some of the work that we've been doing in the past year around community science initiatives. We launched a community-based tree inventory program, inventorying trees in Southwest Yonkers this past summer, which was pretty exciting. And we inventoried over 1,300 trees, trained, it says 40 participants, but it's more like 80 because only half the people took the test and the other ones just kind of helped out. And it's been really great to see, to demonstrate where there are trees, where there aren't, so that we can prioritize where we should be planting trees, but also what species, so that we can ensure that there's more diversity in the urban forest. We also launched an air quality monitoring program this past year. We have 10 fixed monitors collecting both particulate matter and gaseous pollutants. Would be happy to speak with anyone who's interested about that another time. But it's a really great project, and we're working with a nice organization up in Boston who is analyzing some of our findings. And all of this is kind of complementary to the air quality work that New York State is doing. But I think a lot of you came here tonight to hear about our work along the Sawmill River, so I'll get to that. We coordinate the Sawmill River Coalition. This is a partnership between nonprofits, municipalities, and businesses. It was formed back in 2001 with the goal of revitalizing the Sawmill River. So one of our first major projects was the daylighting of the Sawmill River. And the coalition helped to organize public events and engage different stakeholders and work with the Army Corps of Engineers on that project. And then over the past 2 decades, we work with various people from Westchester County to municipal governments to promote adequate planning and restoration projects along the river. And that might include removing invasive vines, planting native trees, and monitoring water quality. And then in the past 5 years or so, we've started publishing some really great reports that sort of analyze flood vulnerability, opportunities for capital projects, And we often collaborate with other organizations, such as the Center for the Urban River at BZAC, to put some of these reports together. And we also, Groundwork Hudson Valley, we do a lot of stewardship along the river with our green team or youth programs, as well as volunteers like yourselves. So we do Trees for Trips programs. So if any of you have sites in mind and you want to do a cleanup event with friends, we can loan tools. We can bring the green team out to help you out. So just let us know. We're continuing to do that work. But our biggest event is our annual Great Sawmill River Cleanup, which I'll promote later in this. But we're in our 15th year, and we've removed like hundreds of tons of trash from the river. I think we don't have a site in Irvington. If y'all have one in mind, let me know, and we'd be happy to work with you. Oh, is it clean now?
Along Sawmill.
Yeah.
But it's closed now, right? Because some dam.
Oh, it's along the dam.
I think that's open now. It just
It
opened.
may have opened.
Yeah,
So anyway,
I-
maybe I'll have a look. Yeah. Oh, okay. Maybe we'll talk after. This is good.
That's
Okay.
Irvington, believe it.
Wow, fun. Wow, fun. Okay. Well, anyway, it's a nice day. Okay, I'm launching into it. So a lot of this work was through a grant that was funded by the Hudson River Estuary Program, or HREP. And we put together a couple of reports. The first one was a report that we did with the New Schools Urban Systems Lab, and it involved some hydrodynamic flood mapping along the Sawmill River. And they used a program called CityCat, which, as you can see, modeled 10-year and 100-year flood events, or 1% and 10% annual storms. Those numbers a little wonky now. They're not really reflective of current conditions, but we're still calling them 1% and 10% just so we kind of have a standard of what we're talking about, right? An hour baseline. And when compared to the FEMA flood maps, we found that there were a lot of tributaries and brooks that showed up as flooding on our maps that don't show up on FEMA maps. And that was one of the biggest findings. I also want to show this slide just because we always appreciate community support. Maps can only tell half the story, and we love getting flood photos. So if there's ever a street where you're like, this always floods, send it to me and I'll include it on these maps, because it really helps to personalize these. And I think a huge thing that we think about is data storytelling, and I think this is a really nice way to do that.
Are you also open for drains that are clogged?
I'm going to get to that, but certainly, eventually. And that report came out of a previous relationship that we had with the Urban Systems Lab, where they did some flood modeling within Yonkers. These maps are a bit more detailed, of course, just because of the scale, right? When you're dealing with a quadrant of Yonkers versus the Sawmill River watershed, you can go into more detail with these. But this was my way to placate the mystery person who was interested in flood modeling, but we can talk about that after. But you can see some really cool GIFs here of what they were able to get. They also did some really great work using the modeling to then simulate some green stormwater infrastructure interventions. So this is Pelton Oval Park. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, on McLean and South Broadway in Yonkers. What you can see on the right is flooding from a 100-year storm. The deeper the color corresponds with the depth of flooding. And then this would be with the intervention, you can see that brown area is able to retain a lot of that stormwater and clean up the area. So that's the kind of work that we've done in the past with the Urban Systems Lab and their CityCat modeling tool. All right, we're back on the main stem, so to speak, of the presentation. After we published that flood modeling report with the Urban Systems Lab, we thought, what do we do with this? We know where we have all these new areas now where we know that it's flooding along the Sawmill River. What do we do with that information? So we held a couple of flood site tours with elected officials, municipal representatives, DPW heads, and members of some CACs or conservation advisory councils along some sites that we saw in our report were really vulnerable to excessive flooding. And one of the things that was brought up from that is New York Assemblywoman Mary Jane Shimsky and Westchester legislator David Imamura thought, put together a list of reports and some case studies for nature-based solutions, and let's see what that looks like. And I should also mention that a lot of this was also meant to complement the Resilient New York report for the Sawmill River watershed that's going to come out maybe either this month or next month. And that's really going to be quite good because it's going to be a way for organizations like ourselves, but also municipalities to get capital funding from the state to do some flood mitigation work. First, I think it's important to point out why nature-based solutions. I'm going to read off my screen here so that I don't ramble on for too long. But I think that we should always take a holistic approach when we're thinking about climate adaptation and resilience. These never should be taken, we should always see these as a complement to hard gray infrastructure, like expanding culverts, raising bridges and the like. But these should be done in tandem. It's always a mosaic to kind of think about how this fits in. Nature-based solutions mimic natural ecosystem functions. The interventions that we recommend in this report are focused on retaining stormwater and reducing inundation during heavy rainfall events that lead to river flooding, but they also enhance climate resilience generally. One of the reasons why we want to consider this along the Sawmill River is because there's been so much development around it. There are so many invasive species of plants that the area, essentially the riparian floodplain, the forest along the river is just really compromised at this point. And what you're getting is trees that don't really belong there that are falling into the river and then clogging drainage pipes, as you're saying. And also the Sawmill River is the southernmost tributary to the Hudson River, as we all know, and leads to a lot of pollution in the area. So we want to make sure that we're cleaning it up. It's also important to point out that nature-based solutions bring a ton of co-benefits. So they also support biodiversity, can improve water quality, and provide some green space to residents when done well.
You maintain the trees that are in that's such a big job.
Yeah, so we remove invasives. And that's really difficult.
Yeah.
But we can kind of get into that because they come back year after year after year. So I'm looking into some goats, but we'll see. We'll see. You got to start small. And I should also note that nature-based solutions historically have really strengthened capital grant projects. So I'm gonna say floodplain bench and some of these other words a lot during this presentation. So I thought maybe it's good to kind of have an illustration of it at first. But essentially what you do with this is in an urban system, you have these really steep banks with an incised channel. The water doesn't have anywhere to go, so it just rushes downstream. So by creating a floodplain bench, you're sort of restoring the floodplain so that when it does flood, the water has somewhere to go and to settle rather than rush downstream. We also have these sand seepage wetlands that'll bring up, and that essentially just allows slows water, allows it to pool, and then kind of filter slowly into a sand medium. It's also good at helping to promote better water quality because a lot of sediment gets trapped in the seepage wetlands. And then maybe my favorite, we have these riffle ponds or step pool systems. These really sort of emulate natural, healthy stream corridors. They help to oxygenate water, which supports wildlife, but they also help to improve water quality by allowing for sediments to settle. And can also stabilize banks, so they slow the water down. Okay, we're back to it. So after the flood site tour, we had a pretty good consensus on some of the sites that we wanted to focus on. And then we had conversations with mayors or other elected officials and CACs to kind of make sure that we had some support around those sites. But we also wanted to make sure that we were identifying sites that were vulnerable, that were either impacting residents or businesses pretty directly. So we weren't really looking at sites that were too far out of the way. So either it had to impact a business or residents or like a real transportation corridor. And we also wanted to focus on tributaries to complement that Resilient New York report that I was referencing earlier. That report is relying mainly on FEMA flood maps, which, as I mentioned earlier, don't really identify the same flooding along tributaries that our modeling did. And also we don't want to compete. We want, again, just like nature-based solutions, we want these to be complementary, right? So if we're stopping flooding along those tributaries, we're easing pressure along the main stem. So this is the first site. I'm going to talk about 3 sites today: Hastings, Greenberg, and Mount Pleasant. So this is the one of our Hastings sites. There's also a corresponding report. So if anyone's interested in reading it after, there's some additional sites, and there's also precedents throughout the report. The first site is these, what we're calling the Boutilliers Brook outfalls, which are those 2 hooks up there. The parcel owner for this site is Hastings-on-Hudson. It's a 1.5 acre site, half of which is in the 100-year floodplain, and the drainage area for this site is 1/4 square miles. And you get a lot of residential flooding in this area. There are 2 outfalls that each of those spurs represent, and they're dominated by invasive plants, namely kudzu. Both sides of the channel slope steeply and are heavily eroded. There's also a fair amount of litter at the site. One other cool thing that we did here is we set up trail cams along the site to show flooding during storms, and that's something that we're going to want to continue doing in the future. But just another way to kind of visualize this and tell that story. And then for each shot, I'll also show the hydrodynamic flood maps. Those are those 2 at the bottom next to the FEMA flood maps. So as you can start to see what I was talking about earlier, where the FEMA flood maps really show just flooding along the Sawmill River, while our maps show some nuisance flooding all around the site. So it's a bit more comprehensive. And the big difference between the 10 and the 100-year flood maps, I think it's 10-year is on the left side of the screen, 100-year on the right, is just depth of flooding. So you don't really get an expanded area, you just get more depth with the 100-year. This is, please.
The flood catchment depends on the residents' time of the water, right? I forget it's got a name. So, you know, are you modeling this as 10-year is a daily rainfall, an hourly rainfall?
Hourly,
It's
1 hour.
And that's the appropriate thing.
This is a 1 hour baseline, yes.
It's the appropriate thing. And what are you using for the 1 10-year and 1 100-year for your hour?
Which modeling program are we using?
No. What precipitation number are you using?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm off the top of my head, I'm not sure what those rates are, but I can find that out after and look it up. We're using whatever the standard is.
Well,
yeah.
but you know, I mean, it's obviously a critical number. And you know, in the last couple of years, we've seen 4.5 inches in an hour. I mean, even what we got in Ida here was probably 3 inches an hour, but certainly.
And that's well above a 100-year storm. A 100-year storm is more like 2 inches an hour.
That's just not appropriate.
No, you're completely right.
We got 8 inches an hour today.
Yeah, we had 3 inches an hour in Ida, and you know the storm, the Bear Mountain storm, they had close to 5 inches in an hour. So it's
Yeah, I would say one of the reasons why we are using the 10 and 100-year is they happen more frequently, and we want to make sure that when we're doing these models that we're getting those sort of more regular numbers. And also with nature-based solutions, it's not going to be able to capture this kind of flooding, right? You need to like rethink gray infrastructure and just urban planning at a much larger level. But those are really great questions. Yeah. Maps from, no, I'm not familiar with that. I'll have to check it out later. What is it?
They have really good maps and they're better than the
Yeah, both really good questions. So thank you both. Yeah.
Structure runs out of utility when it gets to be too many inches per hour. It doesn't want to just.
I think it depends. Well, it depends on the size of the green infrastructure. But I think when we're putting together when we're thinking green infrastructure is ultimately better than gray in that gray has a certain capacity, while green infrastructure can continue to expand it. It's a living system. So with gray infrastructure, you could certainly say this can capture this amount of rainfall within this period of time. It's harder to do that with, a natural floodplain in some ways. Yeah.
The daylighting project, they've got the combination of gray and green,
Mhm.
that's great.
Yes.
Because they've got, you can't see it, but they have built areas under the surface that can capture and hold back rainwater.
Yeah, it goes into flumes and then it comes back out, and they're great systems. Yeah, so that's a pretty good hybrid approach. Yeah. I'm gonna move on unless we have other thoughts. Existing conditions. I'll share proposed conditions next. As I mentioned, the site deals with a lot of erosion and the need to stabilize the stream bank. There's lots of some other invasive species. The biggest issue in this site, and it's probably along the Sawmill River, is a lot of those culverts are just undersized, and that's what's contributing to most of this flooding. And then we also asked folks, what they were most keen on us. What are mitigation strategies? What some of the co-benefits they would like to see done? And they mentioned more native species and then helping with that erosion, of course. I should also note with a lot of these recommendations that these are fairly high level. More analysis is needed to be done to really be certain of what is causing the flooding. So we need more precise information on outfall locations, conditions, soil composition, more detailed topography and channel characteristics, as well as some what they call hydraulic and hydrologic conditions. So with some additional funding, that's what we aim to do for these sites. All of these interventions that we're discussing were brought to us by a consultant called Biohabitats. They're an ecological restoration firm that was pretty great. And all of these interventions respond to the goals and interests of community members. So some of the strategies include increased flood storage capacity by developing floodplain benches that will control erosion, but also help with woody debris along the floodplain. We'll also support, there's some log sills and jams here that are meant to help with floodplain connectivity. And then there's also that step pool system at the outfall locations to slow water as it comes out of those outfalls. And all of these measures should also help with improving water quality in the area. The next site is in Greenberg. It's the Rumbrook Sawmill River confluence. Parcel owner for this site is the town of Greenberg, as well as Con Ed has an easement in the middle of the site. It's a really large site. It's 12 acres, and all of it is within the 100-year floodplain. The site is sort of notorious. One of the things that we aim to do in this report is bring together sites that have been spoken about in disparate reports. So this is one that was mentioned in a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers report from the late 90s, as well as the 2000s. And has been brought up in a lot of municipal reports as well. Flooding here impacts the Sawmill River, the South County Trail, and likely contributes to some flooding upstream that I'll speak about in a little bit.
South County Trail on there?
Yeah, the South County Trail is
Where's 419? Where is it?
This is Greenberg.
Greenberg, oh, where?
So that's Sawmill Parkway going through the middle of it.
Yeah, that's the Sawmill Parkway. Do you know where Babbitt
So that's the part of Sawmill Parkway that used to flood and they've done all the work on.
This part still floods.
It still floods even after the work.
Yes. This is a site that's certainly going to be spoken about a lot in that date plan. Well, they think that, again, this is where we need more analysis, but what we believe is that this contributes to a lot of flooding upstream, especially in Elmsford along Main Street. That area is gets in big trouble. Oh no, my Zoom stopped. No, it's still going. Sorry, I'm gonna move forward unless Archeola Field. I don't know. don't know if y'all can tell, but I'm from Brooklyn. I'm not from here, so I'm doing my best. Yeah, it's right behind there. Also in the report, there are hyperlinks, so it'll just open up the Google map for you if you're curious. But yeah, you can see that field right there. We couldn't access the site, so we used a drone pilot to fly above it. It was just like it was so thick that we actually couldn't get in to see the river. And what's also startling is like I checked it out in March, I took some photos, went back in June and could not get to the river. So it's all moringa, and it just creates like such a dense foliage that you really can't get through. This area is also pretty devastated by dead ash trees. The emerald ash borer really has had its way. So you're getting a lot of woody debris falling into the river at this point, which is causing those backups.
It's moringa.
Moringa is, you can actually kind of see it here, but it looks a little like pot, like it grows up and it's got some fun 5 leaves, pretty dense. Oh, I can mugwort. Yeah, I think mugwort is moringa, maybe. I think they're one and the same. Yeah. Yeah. Also in the report, we have some videos of the drone pilot trying to like fly down into the river until he got too scared. I encourage you to do that because I paid for it and I was like, all right. As we can see, flooding here is really a problem because it really decimates Elmsford and likely Babbitt's Court as well. Babbitt Court has applied to a number of, it's a really small residential community that's like just a hair above the Sawmill River. It's quite low. I think the ground table is also the water table is also quite high here, so the area is routinely flooded. I've already mentioned, but flood mitigation is really the priority here, and some riparian forest restoration. But they also have expressed some interest in sort of opening up this area for more passive recreation. As I mentioned, it's just it's right on the South County Trail, so I think there's a great opportunity here. Proposed conditions. Given the size of the area, we're kind of recommending a ton. One of the key things is what we call hummock and hollow grading. So that's essentially creating like a micro topography of raising and lowering the ground, and that provides some movement. So it's a bit like regenerative stormwater conveyance or that step pool system, but doing this just with kind of mounds. Some additional recommendations would be regrading to help with floodplain connection, wetland restoration to support the floodplain. This is the town of Greenberg, and then there's an easement through the middle that's Con Ed.
They have wires.
They do, but they're 150 feet above the ground.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and there are some precedents of people doing wetland restoration along easements similar to that. It makes it more difficult, but and as I mentioned, getting rid of those ash trees. This has gone both ways. I said I was giving this presentation a couple weeks ago, and I mentioned that one of the things that we're thinking about are cutting down those ash trees, and then you can use them as log jams. So essentially helping out to slow the water down, but also creating microhabitat. But then someone was saying that the ash trees actually decay rather quickly, so you'd actually be creating more issues. So we'll see. We'll see. Right now, we're just kind of saying this. You seem upset though. The last site is Mount Pleasant, and this is a really interesting one. Final case study. Parcel owner for this is the Town of Mount Pleasant Water District. It sits along the Nannyhagen Brook, which is a tributary of the Sawmill River. The site is 2 acres with a drainage area of just over 2 square miles, and it's entirely within the 100-year floodplain, as you can see. And the businesses south of this area get routinely flooded. So that's another reason why we would want to stem it. Sort of similar to the last slide, but with lots of dying hemlocks, lots of invasive plants. And it's, again, a site that's really difficult to access during the summer. It used to be an ice lake, they think.
I'm hemlock because of the invasive vines on it.
I'm not sure.
Oh, the hemlock woolly adulterated, okay.
Mhm.
I don't know, it looks like there's lines on the hemlocks though.
I know, but they take advantage, once the tree is weak, then it becomes more susceptible to these sorts of things. Just showing this just to see that stormwater is really dispersed throughout. But towards the bottom, you get where all those businesses are is where it gets pretty deep. Yeah. And then the final one. So some strategies here, floodplain reconnection and bank stabilization, just to steer the water away from the river and into the wetland. So once it kind of reaches a critical level, it'll kind of push it into the wetland, which has a natural depression. As I mentioned, it used to be this ice lake. Sand seepage wetlands, and then we kind of thought about having this raised boardwalk. We're kind of thinking of ways to, how can you keep this, if the site is going to intentionally flood, how do you use that to your advantage? How can you talk about nature-based solutions, talk about stormwater? How can you keep the site active throughout all conditions? Especially it being right next to this field, this is already a space for recreation. So how can we sort of enhance that and add some sort of education at the site? And that was a priority for the folks in Mount Pleasant. So as I mentioned, we have this, if you're interested in learning more, we do have this case study report, which has a link to a bunch of precedents. I think I'm done. I think I don't want to go too far over my time. So I'm not going to discuss any of those precedents right now. And then just a kind of a plug, Great Selma River Cleanup is on April 26th. We also, we've been doing a 3-part webinar series called Tree Talk. The first one was looking at urban heat and mapping. The second one was about air quality. And this next one is going to be about green stormwater infrastructure. And we're going to have one of the folks who did this modeling for us on that, who can answer some of your more technical questions as well. And then we're also planting a microforest on April 24th, if anyone's interested in that. A microforest is a dense planting of trees in a very small area, and it promotes very fast growth. So we're planting 300 native species in 1,000 square feet. So really, really tight. Yeah, which should be quite exciting. Cool. Well, thank you all so much for listening to me. I really appreciate it. And thank you for having me.